Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror TV series named The Strain Season 2. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with a flashback to the winter of 1932, when Abraham was just a child, living with his grandmother in a remote village in Romania. His grandmother told him a story about a giant who ate children. It was said that there was a nobleman in Albania named Sardu. He suffered from gigantism since childhood. As he grew older, his body became increasingly large but also in great pain. Although he was young, he could only walk with the help of a cane. It was a silver cane with a wolf's head handle, the wolf being the emblem of the Sardu family. His brother believed that wolf's blood could cure his illness, so he organized a hunting expedition in the winter. Unfortunately, they searched the forest for days but couldn't find any wolves. Instead, they were targeted by other creatures. They went from being hunters to becoming prey. His brother and the hunting party were lured away, and by the time Sardu found his brother following the footprints, all he saw was a lifeless body on the ground. His brother's head had been crushed into mashed potatoes. Sardu wanted to avenge his brother, so holding a torch, he entered the cave alone, only to encounter the creature and lose his own life in the process. The monster was excited by Sardu's enormous body and shot out a tendril, knocking him down. Then it stuffed a handful of dirt from a coffin into Sardu's mouth, causing numerous bloodworms to be vomited out. Those worms crawled into Sardu's body through his ears and nostrils, causing him unbearable pain and torment. But after the pain, Sardu changed. His eyes turned red, and he let out a beastly growl, taking advantage of the long night to return to his castle. From then on, Sardu's figure was never seen on the streets during the day, but every night, outside the windows of children, the sound of his cane tapping the ground could be heard. Children who heard this sound all disappeared, and not long after, their bloodless bodies were found in the forest. The grandmother's story left young Abraham stunned, but it also planted a seed of salvation in his heart. His grandmother said that he had to stop the monster that occupied Sardu's body and wreaked havoc everywhere, and the monster was later revealed to be the exact Bloodmaster. Back to the present timeline, after the last failure, Abraham found out that sunlight could not kill the Bloodmaster. He felt doubtful, wondering what had gone wrong. In order to figure out the problem, he went to Church Street alone and entered the underground tunnel. Along the way, he discovered a piece of cloth belonging to the Bloodmaster. Then some strange noises came from within the tunnel. Abraham followed the sound and saw a vampire who introduced himself as Vaughn, the servant of the vampire ancestors. Without further explanation, Vaughn captured and took Abraham to his secret base. However, Vaughn had no ill intentions towards Abraham. He simply wanted to propose a collaboration. Vaughn took Abraham to meet his masters and explained their intentions. There were 7 vampire ancestors whose consciousnesses were connected and could sense each other's actions. However, the 7th ancestor possessed the ability to sever consciousness. He betrayed the ancient truce and became the Bloodmaster known to humans. When Abraham injured him, his power went out of control. The other 6 ancestors witnessed the battle and learned of Abraham's existence, so they wanted to strike a deal with him to fight against the Bloodmaster. As a condition, Abraham must inform Vaughn's hunting team once the Bloodmaster was found. Abraham was reluctant to agree and instead mentioned an ancient book called the Oxydo Lumen. The vampire ancestors were alerted upon hearing about the book, as it recorded the secrets of their strain, Strigoi, and contained a method to kill even the vampire ancestors. Hence, they considered eliminating Abraham. However, faced with a greater enemy, they decided to spare him and let him go. As Abraham was leaving, the vampire ancestors performed a gruesome act of eating a living human, both to satisfy their hunger and to intimidate Abraham. However, Abraham was not scared. Gus, who was next to him, was frightened by that. Abraham knew that the ancient book still existed in 1965. At that time, he was a professor at Vienna's university, and his wife Miriam was still alive at that time. One day, while Abraham was teaching, a wealthy young man in a wheelchair, who claimed to be an admirer of Abraham and believed in the existence of vampires, came to see him. This wealthy man turned out to be the young Palmer. In order to gain Abraham's trust, Palmer mentioned the story of Sardu and claimed to know the whereabouts of the wolf-headed cane. Abraham had always wanted to discover the truth and accepted Palmer's help without questioning his motives. With the help of Palmer, Abraham found a shop that mostly contained items from World War II. He paid his attention to a wolf-headed cane displayed on the counter. The shopkeeper praised the cane. However, when Abraham wanted to pay and take the item, the shopkeeper claimed it was already reserved. Abraham couldn't persuade the shopkeeper with more money. Instead, he exposed the shopkeeper's true identity, a former Nazi doctor who conducted experiments on prisoners during the war. After Germany's defeat, he changed his name and hid in Vienna to make a living. The shopkeeper, not wanting a confrontation, fled, leaving the cane behind, so Abraham took it away. When the shopkeeper returned to his shop later that night, a customer whom the cane was reserved for was waiting for him. The customer was actually the same Thomas who later became the Bloodmaster's servant. Thomas despised him for not being able to handle the situation well. He shot out his tendril and turned the man into a vampire on the spot. After Abraham got the cane, Palmer arranged to meet him again. Palmer finally revealed his true intentions and took out a picture from the ancient book, saying that the book recorded the origin of vampires. The book had changed hands many times in the last century, and its whereabouts were unknown. Palmer hoped Abraham could find it, offering to guarantee Abraham's promotion to a full professorship. Tempted, Abraham agreed, even though he knew he was being used, and disregarded Miriam's advice. Nearly half a century later, Abraham had still not found the said mysterious book. He deduced from the vampire ancestors' reactions that the book indeed existed. After returning to the residence provided by the pest control expert Fett, he remembered he had a storage room and suggested they retrieve items from it the next day. Fett had been busy preparing for the Bloodmaster's attack. He had been welding and reinforcing doors and windows, and even considering extending the defense to nearby streets. This required clearing the area of infected individuals. Meanwhile, the CDC doctor Ephraim and his assistant Nora believed that the bloodworm infection could be cured with modern science. They went to a friend's lab to find medicine, but discovered the researchers inside had already been infected. So the pair returned to the base to devise a plan. They had two options: develop a vaccine to break the infection chain, or mass-produce regenerative organs. Unfortunately, both approaches were difficult to implement without living test subjects or equipment. Ephraim also had to discipline his son, Zach. The boy's personality had changed since his transformation, and he was full of hatred because Ephraim wouldn't let him see his mother. Despite witnessing the transformation of vampires, Zach refused to believe that his mother, Kelly, had become a monster, blaming his father for not saving her. The next day, Ephraim and Nora came up with a new plan. They would create a new plague, using other lethal viruses to infect the infected and thereby break the infection chain. The only problem was finding living test subjects. When Abraham took them to the storage room, they encountered a couple hiding in a warehouse. The couple had been scratched by vampires during an attack. Abraham also found the storage room containing many silver weapons and his old research notes on vampires. Back at the residence, Abraham spent nights going through the notes, hoping to find clues about the ancient book. During this time, Fett and Dutch went to the nearby streets to clear out the infected. Their first stop was a bathhouse. Drawing from their previous experience, the two headed straight to the dark and damp underground bathroom and found large areas of bloodstains on the walls. Inside were many infected people, asleep. They used the silver bullets made by Abraham to give the infected a surprise explosion. They then decapitated the remaining ones who could still move. After dealing with all the infected, the two took time to enjoy a refreshing swim in the pool, with their smelly hormones filling the water. On the other side, Ephraim brought the infected couple back to the lab, explained the situation to them, and persuaded them to become test subjects for their experiments. The couple decided to sacrifice themselves for the fight against the plague. Ephraim then sampled the brain matter of the vampires and began experimenting in petri dishes. He added various highly infectious viruses to the dishes, but the results were not as expected. The viruses were instantly eradicated, and the test subjects' conditions worsened. The wife was in pain and showed signs of transformation, so they had to use painkillers to stabilize her condition. Seeing this, the husband began to have second thoughts. Ephraim, worried that they would run away, had no choice but to tie them to the hospital beds. However, after controlling them, Ephraim felt somewhat desperate. If they couldn't find a suitable virus before the test subjects fully transformed, the experiment would be declared a failure. Fortunately, Nora discovered a pure experimental strain of bacteria left by a friend and, after some manipulation, cultivated a new strain that could devour the brain matter of vampires. This news excited Ephraim, and the two immediately cultivated more strains and injected them into the test subjects. As Ephraim and Nora made progress, Abraham also found a clue. It was a piece of paper tucked inside a notebook, the very same picture Palmer had given him years ago. Meanwhile, Palmer was still busy serving the Bloodmaster. As he was now possessing Sardou's body that had been burned by sunlight, it could no longer support the Bloodmaster's spirit. He needed a new host. Therefore, he summoned Thomas and instructed him to have the transferred survivor Bolivar steal back the soil stored in the theater and find some children for him. This task could only be carried out by the aging Palmer, who was eager to serve the Bloodmaster in exchange for an immortal life to cure his illness. When he saw the burns on the corner of Thomas's mouth, he couldn't help but mock him for being injured by Abraham and his vampire hunting team. At this point, Palmer didn't know about the Bloodmaster's injury, so he didn't use it as leverage to threaten Thomas. At this time, a woman named Coco appeared. She was a real estate agent, and Palmer wanted to buy a new residence for the Bloodmaster. She happened to have a factory on hand, which included a sewer system capable of transporting liquid, perfectly meeting the Bloodmaster's needs. Palmer then signed the contract. Following this, he sponsored a school for the blind, providing the children with passage out of Manhattan so they could attend classes away from the epidemic in the suburbs. The naive principal of the blind school believed him and led the children onto a bus. However, when the bus arrived at its destination, they were greeted by Thomas at the entrance of a factory. All the children became food for the Bloodmaster. To exact revenge, the Bloodmaster had Thomas awaken Kelly and reserve her obsession for her son, Zach. They then entered the basement of the factory, where a pool filled with soil was located. As Thomas chanted, the infected children emerged from the soil, the very same blind children. Under Kelly's control, the children saw the people before them as their mothers, but Kelly couldn't sense Zach's scent on any of them. She directly twisted off one child's head. As this tragedy unfolded, Palmer, the mastermind behind it all, reached a cooperation with the mayor, presenting himself as a generous benefactor aiding New York during the epidemic. He then offered the real estate agent a high-paying position as his secretary. Faced with a generous salary, Coco resigned from her job and joined Palmer immediately. So when he built a food distribution center, Coco quickly crafted a dramatic speech. On the opening day, Palmer was somewhat embarrassed to read the speech, but the atmosphere at the venue was effectively stirred up. However, this distribution center was not as simple as it seemed. Although it provided essential goods to the public, people still had to obtain credentials for free access. They were asked to provide their blood type as proof of identity instead of their ID. At this point, Abraham appeared in the crowd and exchanged glances with Palmer. Palmer was informed that the Bloodmaster had been injured. This left him feeling defeated, but he ordered his subordinates to apprehend Abraham. Unfortunately for Palmer, Fett was well prepared, causing an explosion at the scene and whisking Abraham away amidst the chaos. Abraham's actions were meant to probe whether Palmer had the ancient book. He confronted Palmer and surmised that the ancient book was not in his possession. This meant that they had a chance to find the book. On the other side, Dr. Barnes, the new director of the New York Health Department, was already making moves. He proposed to the mayor to establish quarantine stations, isolating all infected individuals and observing them for 24 hours while investigating people they had been in contact with. If anyone was found to be infected, force would be used to restrict their movements, but this was akin to providing covert protection for the infected. The scene shifts to the vampire-turned-Bolivar, who had received Thomas's orders for the Bloodmaster's plan. He was packing soil left from the vampire coffin and transporting it to the factory every night. However, he didn't use any vehicle, but rather walked the streets in a strange dress, dragging the package behind him. This caught the attention of two patrolling officers. They opened the package's zipper and found it full of unremarkable soil. But as soon as an officer reached in, countless bloodworms burrowed into his skin from the soil. Bolivar then let out a long howl, and several vampires leaped down from the building above, quickly dealing with the officers. After completing the task, Bolivar received a new order to become Palmer's security guard. Palmer was unaware of this arrangement, but faced with Thomas's threat, he had no choice but to accept the surveillance. However, after Thomas left, Palmer was full of curiosity towards Bolivar, thinking that he would also become one of this kind. He constantly asked questions, which annoyed Bolivar. He despised humans just as humans despised vampires, but both of them were ultimately servants of the vampires. Palmer wanted to communicate with the Bloodmaster through him. Even though the Bloodmaster could observe the outside world through the eyes of his kind, Bolivar couldn't sense the Bloodmaster and advised Palmer not to waste his efforts. However, their conversation raised Coco's suspicions. Her intuition told her that there was a problem with Bolivar and Thomas, and she urged Palmer not to associate with them, but she was coldly rejected by her new boss. Meanwhile, Ephraim's experiments continued. He injected the virus into test subjects, but the reaction was too fast, and the mutated wife died in pain. He could only pin his hopes on another test subject. While waiting for the results, Ephraim returned to base to rest. Fett had just come back from outside, having printed warning posters and plastered them around the neighborhood, and was preparing to blow up the subway tunnel. The base was located in the Red Hook district, surrounded by water on 3 sides. Once the tunnel was destroyed, the entrance to Manhattan would be sealed off. But Ephraim was not in the mood to listen to Fett, as he discovered that his mischievous son Zach had disappeared, probably for only an hour. They went out to search for him and coincidentally saw a bus leaving. Ephraim quickly chased after it and, sure enough, found Zach on board. Zach left without saying goodbye because he thought his mother wanted to see him and had to go find her. Ephraim was speechless and could only give his son a big hug. Beside Dutch, she saw a missing person poster on a pole. The photo on the poster was of her ex-girlfriend Nikki, the one who had stolen all her belongings. Dutch still had feelings for Nikki and couldn't help but worry. This made Fett uncomfortable. When Zach returned to the base, Fett tried to distract himself by chatting with Abraham, but he was ignored. Abraham had locked himself to conduct experiments. It turned out that after beheading a vampire one night, he had secretly collected some bloodworms into a bottle. He then boiled the bloodworms in water and repeatedly filtered and processed them. After refining the bloodworms into a liquid, he poured it into a brown bottle and dripped the extract into his eyes. However, the next day when Nora called Abraham for breakfast, she found him collapsed on the floor, his eyes bleeding and not even breathing. Nora quickly administered first aid, and after some coughing, Abraham was saved. But Abraham didn't want to reveal the truth and lied that bleeding eyes were a sign of old age. Nora was skeptical, and when Abraham felt better, she asked him about it as a friend. He confessed that he was already 94 years old. His agility at such an advanced age wasn't due to good health, but rather because he sustained his life by consuming bloodworms. These creatures couldn't be eaten directly, but had to be refined into a liquid and absorbed through the eyes. This practice went against Abraham's beliefs, but he'd rather die fighting Bloodmaster than slowly wither away as a frail old man. Nora understood Abraham's feelings and promised to help keep his secret. Later, Nora went to work in the lab. Ephraim had already started working, and to prevent his son from causing more trouble and running away, he had brought him along. But Zach didn't understand his good intentions and challenged his experiments. He even hated that his father referred to the infected as vampires. While Ephraim stepped out to compose himself, Zach knocked over a vial of the virus that Ephraim and Nora had painstakingly created. Ephraim chose to reason with Zach, and grabbing him by the collar, he brought him to the bedside of an experimental subject to see the true nature of a vampire. The monster with flesh tendril protruding from its mouth was what his mother looked like now. Zach was frightened into silence, and only then did Ephraim feel reassured enough to continue with his experiments. He injected the experimental subject with the virus, and surprisingly, the results were quite good. The subject had no violent reactions, but it kept staring at Zach. Ephraim guessed that the Bloodmaster was observing Zach, so he boldly declared that he would kill thousands of vampires, and that if cornered, he would kill Zach and then himself, never allowing the Bloodmaster to turn them. Meanwhile, to destroy the subway tunnel, Fett and Dutch decided to conduct a field investigation. However, Dutch was somewhat distracted. Seeing 2 women showing affection to each other on the street, she recalled the poster from the night before. She speculated that it was Nikki's mother who had posted it and wanted to find her. Fett knew that Nikki was a lingering issue for Dutch, so he decided to face the problem together and drove Dutch to Nikki's house. Upon entering, however, Nikki's mother didn't welcome Dutch and blamed her for ruining her daughter's life. Dutch didn't want to argue and just reminded Nikki's mother to let her know if she heard any news about Nikki. While the 2 women were talking, Fett was still in the car, listening to the radio. A female senator had reportedly arrived in Washington, and she disagreed with Barnes's approach to home quarantine. She decided to use force to clear the area. Thus, Staten Island in New York became the first plague-free area. To show her determination to fight to the end, she had the bodies of vampires hung out for public display. Anyone entering Staten Island would see the dismembered corpses of vampires. Fett quite agreed with this approach, but he didn't know about the political deals taking place behind the scenes. The mayor of New York initially didn't support the senator's methods, but seeing their effectiveness and fearing she would steal the spotlight, he privately spoke to her. He agreed to grant her authority to command, but only if he would share the credit, making it appear that they were fighting the epidemic together. The senator had no choice but to agree. Fett wanted to share the good news with Dutch, but upon her return, he saw her in a fit of rage, clearly wronged at Nikki's house. Before Fett could comfort her, she passionately approached him, and they began to let loose in the narrow but hormone-smelly cabin. On the other side, Vaughn's vampire team was also in action. They planned to kidnap Palmer and had Gus disguise as an elevator repairman to enter the building. This distraction allowed Vaughn's team to infiltrate the underground, waiting for Gus to control the security guard leading the way. After modifying the elevator's sensors, Vaughn and his team all fell to the bottom of the elevator shaft, then used the elevator to reach Palmer's office floor. However, the security in the control room noticed something strange and quickly took Palmer and Coco away. Vaughn knew little about human technology. He fell into a trap. Palmer activated the room's ultraviolet light system, leaving the Vaughn team with nowhere to escape. They were completely wiped out. Only Gus, who was still a human, managed to escape. At the same time, Ephraim's experiment showed results. The test subject's body became less swollen after the infection spread throughout. This indicated that they wouldn't die easily, and it was time to test the transmission. Ephraim decided to poison the subjects that night and asked Fett to help transport the test subject to a subway entrance. The tunnel there was the largest vampire lair in the Red Hook district. However, when the test subject was taken out of the car, he did not enter the tunnel but turned to another road. The three had to follow him. They soon arrived at a psychiatric hospital and dealt with the vampires nearby. Inside, Nora found medical records at the front desk, one of which belonged to the test subject's son. It turned out that the couple's child had schizophrenia and was being treated in the psychiatric hospital. But everyone there had been infected, and the test subject's son was missing. Upon arrival, the test subject slept in a room with others of his kind, naturally transmitting the infection to other vampires. On the other hand, Gus had nowhere to go after escaping. He wandered the streets and used his remaining cash to eat at a restaurant run by a mother and daughter. There, he recognized a robust chef called Angel, who was skilled in martial arts and once an actor in a movie fighting against villainous vampires. However, he broke his leg in the filming, becoming a chef to make a living. After finishing his meal, Gus returned home to find it reeking, his brother's corpse lying on the floor and his mutated mother hiding in a room. Upon seeing Gus, she attacked him without hesitation. Gus didn't want to fight his mother, but when the Bloodmaster mocked his failed mission and said his mother was nothing but a walking corpse, Gus couldn't bear to kill her. He grabbed some clothes and left, making sure to lock the door to prevent his mother from causing further harm. At this time, Ephraim, Fett, and Nora had just returned to their base. They planned to get some rest before heading back to the psychiatric hospital at night to observe the infection's progress. However, Fett excitedly worked on assembling bombs, while a television in the background played the news. The senator was giving a live speech, announcing a curfew and a crackdown in the Red Hook district. Peacekeeping forces would be sent to search houses and eliminate infected individuals to ensure the safety of others. Ephraim, wanting to mend his strained relationship with his son Zach, took advantage of the sunny weather and brought him to a nearby playground to practice playing ball. But Zach was not in the mood. Feeling disheartened, he remembered his mother and was excellent at playing ball. It was through her that he had come to love the sport. However, he could not see his mother at this time, and the desire to play disappeared. Meanwhile, Dutch found Abraham and informed him of the rift between Palmer and his former assistant, Fitzwilliam. After leaving the Stoneheart group, Fitzwilliam had gone to Staten Island to seek refuge with his older brother, who worked as a firefighter there. This reminded Abraham of a past event. Years ago, Palmer had asked him to find the ancient book, while he was accompanied by a bodyguard, whose last name was also Fitzwilliam. He was actually the father of the now Fitzwilliam and his brother. Abraham and Palmer had parted ways in 1996 when Abraham had found a clue to the ancient book. It had been purchased by a Hungarian in 1923 at an auction, and its whereabouts had been unknown ever since. Abraham suspected that the Hungarian had gone north, survived by assuming a false identity, and that the area had later been leveled by the Nazi Hitler. A supply train happened to leave the area at that time, and its cargo manifest indicated that it carried a religious painting, possibly the ancient book. The train's destination was a monastery at the foot of the Austrian Alps. Young Palmer decided to go and see for himself. However, when he and Abraham arrived at the monastery, they found it deserted and reeking of excrement. The library had been ransacked, as though it had just been robbed. They were too late and only encountered a terrified boy hiding in a cabinet. According to the boy Rudyard, the abbot believed that the ancient book was cursed and had burned it. Before Abraham could ask for more details, screams echoed through the monastery. The frightened boy quickly fled, and Abraham could only follow. But after Abraham left, Thomas appeared in front of Palmer. Thomas knew that Palmer was searching for the secret to immortality and offered to reveal all the answers once Abraham returned from dealing with the vampires. Because of that, Palmer changed his mind. He was no longer obsessed with the ancient book, but with an immortal life. Against Abraham's advice, he terminated their collaboration. As a result, Abraham's pursuit of vampires lost its funding, and he missed the opportunity to become a tenured professor. Palmer was a pure businessman, willing to betray others for his benefit. He had once broken his agreement with Abraham for Thomas, and now he could sell out others as well. Under the guise of providing financial aid, he invited banking and investment tycoons to a meeting to discuss matters. But when the conference ended and the attendees left the financial center, they were ambushed and wiped out by vampires lurking nearby. Only Palmer was allowed to leave the scene. Abraham finally found Fitzwilliam and wanted to have Fitzwilliam reveal any clues about the ancient book. However, in Fitzwilliam's memory, the book had already been burned, and Palmer had given up the search. Abraham suspected that Fitzwilliam was hiding something but didn't want to force him, so he left his contact information in case Fitzwilliam changed his mind. Meanwhile, after leaving home, Gus returned to the restaurant where Angel was. Although he brought in money as a customer, he was unwelcome for being too close to the owner's daughter. Angel tried to drive Gus away, so Gus had to leave obediently. By then, it was night, and Ephraim began his observation mission. But when the group arrived at the psychiatric hospital, there were no traces of vampires. Ephraim wanted to find infected vampires nearby, but Fett didn't want to take risks, and he had more important tasks to do. So he left the truck with Ephraim and Nora and went alone to the subway station to destroy the tunnel. They split up, and Ephraim found the test subject outside the hospital, whose life was nearing its end. Ephraim decided to end the subject's suffering when he heard vampires nearby. Following the sound, he found an infected vampire's corpse on the ground. The infection seemed to be working well. Just then, more vampires jumped from the building above. Several infected vampires stood on the roof, forced to end their own lives to prevent the infection from spreading to their kind. Ephraim laughed at the success of his experiment, but was unaware that danger was approaching. Kelly's scouts, tracking Zach's scent, had entered the Red Hook district and would soon find his whereabouts. At this time, Fett had entered the subway station and installed the explosives, lighting the fuse with style. He turned to leave, but due to the curfew order, the police were guarding the subway's vicinity, revealing his presence. To buy time for the explosion, Fett had to divert the police's attention. However, after the explosion succeeded, he was arrested and sent to jail. Under the order of the senator, the Red Hook district is purged in an effort to create a plague-free zone in New York. The National Guard conducts door-to-door searches, carrying weapons and breaking into people's housing without mercy. They kick down residents' closed doors and apprehend people for testing. If an infected person is found, they are shot in the head. The guards are ruthless in their actions, but they still encounter resistance from skilled scouts who dodge their bullets and remain unharmed. These scouts are under Kelly's command, tracking Zach to the Red Hook district. At this moment, Ephraim enters a bar. He wants to mass-produce the anti-vampire bacteria and needs to collaborate with a pharmaceutical factory. However, with his fugitive status, it is impossible for him to establish connections in such a short time. Right then, his close friend Rob fits the bill. But Rob lives in Washington, D.C., and with New York under lockdown, Ephraim can only travel there via a government official's special train. To avoid exposing his true identity, he needs a new one. Thus, he contacts someone in the bar who sells fake IDs, buying 3 new documents with plans to take Nora and Zach with him. However, Zach doesn't want to leave, and Nora thinks Ephraim is being too impatient. Not to mention, they don't have a detailed plan, and leaving the city disguised as a family may attract unwanted attention. She decides to stay in New York with Zach, allowing Ephraim to act without any concerns. Just then, Dutch learns about Fett's imprisonment, so Nora goes with her to the police station to rescue him, leaving Ephraim alone. He shaves his stylish hair, then sweeps a pile of dirt in front of the door. He places the bacteria samples and dirt into an urn, bids farewell to Zach, and boards the train to Washington, D.C. After passing the ticket check at the train station, he encounters trouble on the train. He goes to the dining car to buy a drink and almost comes face to face with his former boss, Barnes. Fortunately, Barnes is busy discussing his itinerary with his assistant and doesn't notice Ephraim. He turns around and leaves. Ephraim found a compartment and pretended to chat with a familiar face. The stranger thought Ephraim looked familiar, as if he had seen through his disguise. After exchanging a few words, the stranger made an excuse to leave, forcing Ephraim to switch compartments once again. But just as he settled down, his former boss Barnes entered the area. With their eyes about to meet, Ephraim hurriedly slipped away and hid in the restroom of another compartment. Unexpectedly, he encountered the National Security Agency conducting compulsory quarantine checks. To avoid suspicion, he had no choice but to leave the restroom. However, after the quarantine ended, Ephraim came face to face with Barnes. But Barnes pleaded that he didn't want to serve the Bloodmaster any longer and was guilt-ridden by his former acts. He was impressed by Ephraim's plan to save the world using bioweapons and promised to let him go. But Ephraim knew Barnes was no saint and immediately overpowered him, deciding to jump off the train and escape. But upon opening the train door, he regretted his decision as the train was moving too fast. With Barnes still threatening to call the police, Ephraim quickly changed his mind, throwing Barnes off the train. As the train arrived in Washington, Barnes's assistant discovered that the newly appointed director of health had disappeared and urgently contacted the police at the station. Ephraim overheard the conversation and calmly headed for the exit. As the police searched his luggage, he lied that he was taking his wife's ashes back to her hometown for burial, successfully smuggling the bacteria sample to his friend. Meanwhile, Nora and Dutch arrived at the police station. Due to the compulsory quarantine, many people were arguing their case. It was bad enough that the individuals were being isolated. Everyone needed to work to make a living, and enforced time off meant no income. Even the senator's attempt to appease the public failed to calm their anger. Nora saw this as an opportunity. She knew a method to diagnose infections without isolation and, as a biochemist, struck a deal with the senator. If she released Fett, Nora would reveal the method. Fett didn't suffer much in prison. He even had a good time with fellow inmates. However, when Dutch saw the scratches on his face, she became furious, believing he had suffered in jail. She confronted the police, but after chatting with an officer, they began discussing vampire hunting. Fett eagerly offered to help deal with the vampire scouts. He left Nora behind and followed the police to the public housing district, terminating some infected individuals wandering in the corridors. However, when they entered the room where the scouts were supposedly hiding, there was no sign of them. Instead, they found an open vent in the bathroom and heard crawling sounds from within the walls. Fett pinpointed the location by sound and stabbed a hole in the wall, drawing out the hidden infected individuals. He and Dutch then cooperated to take them down. Afterward, he pried open the elevator door in the hallway and discovered a group of infected resting inside. Dutch used the silver powder grenade, and as it exploded, all the vampires screamed in pain and died. This was far more powerful than the police's headshot strategy. On the other side, Nora used ultraviolet light to irradiate the skin, and if wriggling bloodworms were detected, it indicated an infection that required isolation. Those without signs of bloodworms were released. The senator greatly admired Nora's abilities and asked her to check a special patient for her nephew. The night before, her nephew had been scratched by a scout while accompanying the police guards. Although the doctors said he was fine, the senator arranged for him to be hospitalized for observation. When Nora saw the bloodworms under his skin, it confirmed that the senator had made the right decision. However, this also meant that her loved one was beyond help and had to be terminated before turning. Nora prepared a euthanasia potion, and with a single injection into the nephew, he would peacefully leave to meet Jesus. The senator couldn't bring herself to do it, so Nora had to do it for her. Nora knew the pain of losing a loved one and wanted to comfort the senator, but she didn't know how. Meanwhile, Abraham was still searching for the ancient book. He found out that a dealer named Cream had acquired a batch of old books, so he went to negotiate a deal with him alone. The man thought Abraham was weak and initially planned to rob him. However, the man was subdued by Abraham during the negotiation and had to obediently hand over the books. After flipping through all the books, Abraham didn't find the one he wanted, so he left a deposit for the man and asked him to help look for clues about the book. On his way home, Abraham encountered Fitzwilliam, who had changed his mind and decided to help Abraham against Palmer. At that time, Palmer was taking his secretary Coco out for dinner when a priest approached them, claiming to have a clue about the ancient book. He said they were waiting for a reply from an informant and asked Palmer to stay in touch if he was interested. This made Coco suspicious, thinking that her boss had a secret he couldn't reveal. Later, when they returned to the office building, Coco intentionally let down Palmer's guard by inviting him to dance. Just as Palmer was enchanted by Coco, a plane landed at New York's airport, which was a no-fly zone. Security immediately questioned the situation, and the pilot explained they had no choice but to land there due to a technical issue with the plane. Moreover, a passenger had become ill and disembarked, and if security wanted to question them, they could still catch up. Security quickly set out, with dogs leading the way, but they only found the wire fence cut open and no trace of the passenger. It's revealed that this passenger was incredibly agile. Wearing a helmet and carrying a treasured sword, it was none other than Mr. Quinlan, an elite vampire and the one who created the Vaughn's hunting team. With the help of humans, Mr. Quinlan easily entered Manhattan and went to talk to the 3 vampire ancestors there, mocking their incompetence. He said they should have taken action 7 centuries ago, and now they were anxious about the Bloodmaster causing trouble and losing Vaughn. The 3 vampire ancestors promised to cooperate fully with Mr. Quinlan. He sensed that the Bloodmaster was injured, but didn't know the details, so he wanted to talk to Abraham and the others. However, they still needed the help of the human hunter, Gus. At this moment, Gus was pestering Angel in the restaurant, saying that he admired Angel's acting, but Angel kept ignoring him. The shop owner asked his daughter to deliver some takeout. It was dangerous outside with vampires lurking in the housing complex. The girl was too scared to go alone and tried to persuade her father to give up on this order. However, her father thought it was time for her to contribute to the family, so she reluctantly agreed. Seeing her fear, Gus offered to accompany and protect her. Angel didn't want the girl to be in the company of someone like Gus, who had served time in prison and was a well-known small-time criminal. Worried that Gus might harm the girl, Angel decided to join them as a protector. They walked to the delivery destination and successfully handed over the order. As they were leaving, 2 wandering infected appeared in the corridor. Gus easily resolved the situation with a single silver axe, saving Angel, who was struggling with his leg injury. Meanwhile, Ephraim finally met with his friend Rob. He explained the situation in New York and asked for Rob's help to contact a pharmaceutical factory to manufacture a counteragent, and then contact the Department of Defense to spread it, waging biochemical warfare against the vampires. Rob fully supported Ephraim but couldn't involve the Department of Defense. However, he knew the head of the National Guard and could help persuade him. Rob also had a contact at the pharmaceutical factory, a woman who was the factory's representative there. He immediately arranged a meeting with her. Ephraim presented some slides showing the effects of the infection. The representative was amazed, and when she heard that 3 million people could be infected, she saw it as a golden opportunity for fame and fortune. She called the research center director, and while they were waiting for a response, the 3 of them went to a bar to chat. Ephraim shared his experiences as a doctor abroad, captivating the representative. She became smitten with this man, despite not knowing his true identity. When the biopharmaceutical department decided to manufacture the infection, Rob found an excuse to leave, leaving the representative and Ephraim alone. The 2 naturally ended up in bed. However, after a hormone night, the representative asked Ephraim to sign a contract granting the pharmaceutical factory exclusive operating rights and product ownership. This was clearly war profiteering. Ephraim felt that the factory shouldn't be so greedy at this time, and the representative shouldn't have slept with him just for a contract. But he was helpless, so even though he felt used, he reluctantly signed the contract. Afterward, Ephraim had to go to meet with the head of the National Guard. The commander was initially unwilling to get involved in biochemical warfare. Instead, he recommended a large company with a military background, the Stoneheart Group, led by Palmer. Ephraim rejected this suggestion, stating that any private enterprise would be acceptable except for Stoneheart. Rob chimed in, emphasizing that this was a matter of national importance. The commander valued Rob's opinion and agreed to help. At the same time, the pharmaceutical factory was working around the clock on tests and would have results within 72 hours. Once approved, production could begin immediately. Ephraim wanted to share this good news with Rob, but he couldn't reach him on the phone, and no one seemed to be at his home. The representative took advantage of the time alone with Ephraim to reveal her true feelings. She said she hadn't used him and just followed the rules for the sake of their goal. Ephraim forgave the representative and even planned to spend the night with her. However, when the 2 entered Rob's bedroom, they discovered he had been shot in the head, his lifeless body on the floor. The killer emerged from the shadows, and Ephraim realized he was the target. The assassin killed the representative and tried to attack Ephraim, but he killed the attacker instead. From the assassin's phone, Ephraim learned that Palmer was the one pulling the strings. Meanwhile, Abraham was still studying Palmer's movements. Fitzwilliam knew that his former boss Palmer had purchased a lot of industrial property in New York. His construction team had built secret prisons for the U.S. military, and it seemed they were plotting something again. However, Fitzwilliam didn't know more details. At this time, Abraham received a call from Nora, who said she was in trouble. It turns out, to make Zach happy, she had used her connections with the senator to take him to a police station to pick out supplies. On their way back, they were attacked by scouts led by Kelly. Nora and Zach could only hide in a nearby church and call Abraham for help. The church could keep Kelly at bay, but it was useless against the wall-climbing scouts. They broke the glass to enter the church, opened the door for Kelly, and located Zach's hiding place by scent. However, when Kelly followed the scent, she only found Zach's scarf. Nora had already taken him outside, hiding elsewhere to buy time. They were eventually discovered, and just in time, Abraham and the other two arrived, armed with silver bullet handguns. They fired at the scouts, who were frightened and scattered. However, after Nora killed a scout, Fitzwilliam was hit in the leg by another. Even though Abraham beheaded the attacker and Kelly was chased away by Fett, Fitzwilliam's life was coming to an end. He didn't want to turn into a vampire, so he asked Abraham to grant him a mercy killing and send him to meet Jesus. At the same time, Palmer approached Thomas again, proposing a meeting with the Bloodmaster. He claimed that the plan was moving on to the next phase, and only a face-to-face meeting could ensure its success. In reality, he was trying to determine if the Bloodmaster was injured, but Thomas refused him. After dealing with Palmer, he led Bolivar into the basement, claiming that the Great Transformation was about to happen. The Bloodmaster's custom-made coffin was stored there, and his weak body lay within it, getting healed from the soil. As Thomas approached, determined to offer his body as a vessel for the Master, the latter chose Bolivar instead. Just like when he occupied Sardou's body, the Bloodmaster's essence entered Bolivar, transferring his soul as well. Sardou's body collapsed like a patient curled up on the floor. Thomas held the lifeless body and cried, thinking he should be the chosen one. But the grieving Thomas was quickly mind-controlled by the Bloodmaster. Thomas then swore allegiance to his master, who now wore Bolivar's skin and vowed to follow him as always. The scene shifts to Palmer staring at his secretary Coco, like a hunter who had fallen in love with his prey. But his subordinates suddenly entered and brought news from Washington. They had intercepted Ephraim's plan, and Palmer's allies controlled the biochemical weapon. They had also killed the relevant informants, but Ephraim had escaped and vanished. In reality, he had already returned to New York but was discovered injured by Nora. He treated his wounds with alcohol, then endured the pain and went to a bar to drown his sorrows for his failure. When a drunken Ephraim returned to the base, he found a strange woman in his home. It was Nikki, who had previously stolen Dutch's belongings. After a night of passion with Fett, Dutch went back to her own house to get a change of clothes. This made Fett regretful. He discovered that Dutch's door was locked from the inside, meaning someone had broken into her home. Fett kicked the door open and found a woman hiding in a closet, her eyes filled with tears of fear. Dutch recognized her as Nikki, her long-lost friend, and gave her a hug to celebrate their reunion. Once Nikki had calmed down, she recounted her experiences since fleeing the gas station. She had twisted her ankle on the way and should have gone to the hospital, but she was too scared to wander around and had sought refuge in Dutch's house. Dutch, not holding any grudges, was happy that Nikki was alive. This upset Fett, who urged Dutch to return to the base with her belongings. Unexpectedly, Dutch brought Nikki along. Back at the base, Fett talked privately with Dutch, asking her to think about Nikki's actions. Dutch, however, believed Nikki had suffered and was mentally unstable. She refused to tell Nikki about her relationship with Fett and even canceled her plans with Abraham to stay home with Nikki. Nikki sensed the unusual relationship between Dutch and Fett, but when she tried to pry further, the atmosphere grew awkward. Just then, Ephraim returned, reeking of alcohol. He didn't like Nikki either and even gave her a nickname. At this time, Fett and Abraham were outside taking care of business. Before his death, Fitzwilliam had left them the address of Palmer's properties. Abraham found one of the factories suspicious, so they cut through the fence and sneaked in. They discovered the blind school bus, but their whereabouts were also being monitored. Just as the observer was about to report, he was suddenly taken out by Quinlan, who appeared from behind.